Hyvää iltapäivää ja tervehdys täältä Helsingin kaivopuistosta, Puistokatu 4, Tieteen ja Toivon talosta. Toivotan teidät kaikki lämpimästi tervetulleeksi täällä salissa ja siellä livestreamin päässä seuraamaan Akkordin webinaaria, jonka aiheena on tänään Oregonin malli sille, miten ympäristöön ja muitakin julkisluonteisia probleemia, ongelmia voidaan ratkaista osapuolten välisellä yhteistyöllä. Ja me olemme saaneet vieraaksi Oregonista Steve Greenwoodin. Hän tulee National Policy Consensus Centeristä ja hän pitää meille tässä hyvin kiinnostavan puheenvuoron. Ja sen jälkeen meillä on tässä luvassa kommenttipuheenvuoro kansanedustaja Henrik Wikströmiltä, joka on nauhoitettu, eli hän on videolla meidän kanssamme täällä. Ja sen jälkeen meillä on hyvin aikaa keskustelulle. Täällä paikan päällä on useita henkilöitä ja uskon, että teemoja, kysymyksiä nousee, joita sitten täällä käsittelemme vielä tässä kaksituntisen lähetyksen loppupuolella. Tämä työ on osa Akkordin kehitystyötä, jota teemme yhteistyössä TAH-säätiön kanssa. Pyrimme löytämään nimenomaisesti vihreän siirtymän konfliktien ennakointiin ja ratkaisemiseen uudenlaisia toimintamalleja. Ja olemme tehneet ahkerasti työtä, katsoneet kansainvälisiä esimerkkejä ja pohdimme, että mitä sovellettavaa Suomeen löytyy. Muun muassa tänään keskitytään Oregoniin ja siellä on hyvin pitkät perinteet tällaisesta monen osapuolen välisestä yhteisestä ongelmanratkaisusta. Mutta pidemmittä puheitta, without further ado, I would like to invite Steve Greenwood to give his keynote today. Steve has been visiting Finland several times, so 2015 was the first visit that Steve and his colleagues were in Finland visiting Akkordi, and we have been doing joint training and also project work on natural resource conflicts. And Steve is one of our mentors and beloved friend. So Steve, please.
Okay, you can all hear me, yes? Thank you, Jona. And thank you all for being here, either in person or virtually. I'm very, very happy to be here and be able to make some remarks and maybe engage in some dialogue with all of you about a topic that's very important to me. I do have to say, to begin with, this is the first presentation I've ever made in my stocking feet, but I kind of like it, and I may have to take this idea back to Oregon with me. I want to thank, in particular, Akkordi for inviting me to be here, and it has been a wonderful partnership that we have had with Akkordi over the last 9 years. I, as Jona said, I work for the National Policy Consensus Center in Oregon at Portland State University. And we have been doing collaborative processes and projects for more than 20 years. And we have learned a lot over those 20 years. We have done probably between 200 and 300 different collaborative processes. And some of them have been more successful than others, but we have learned a lot of lessons. And I'm here today to talk about one of the most important lessons that we have learned. I'm going to talk a little bit this afternoon about the role of conveners, and I'll explain that in a moment. Some of the keys to success for good convening, bringing people together. And then I'm going to talk about some case examples that will show and demonstrate some of the principles and some of the advantages of using leaders as conveners that these projects have shown. So what do leaders, particularly elected leaders, bring to the task of resolving public issues? Well, they bring a number of things, a number of qualities that are very helpful. First of all, public leaders have, by their very position, a platform or status for advocacy, for advocating certain solutions. They bring decision-making authority, which is one of the things that they run for office for in the first place. They bring some control of resources. You know, they have some control over the budget of their particular jurisdiction. And they also bring access to information and data. So those are things that elected leaders bring to the task of resolving public issues. But what's missing from that list? Well, it's a leadership tool that is often underutilized. And it's one that, from my perspective, may be the most powerful in addressing public problems. And that is their ability as leaders to convene key stakeholders to work together and solve the problems. Now, complex public problems, by their nature, require collaboration. Think of some of the most complex public issues and public problems here in Finland, and try to imagine that any one jurisdiction or any one organization could try to solve it on its own. It's highly unlikely. There's a need for coordination and collaboration and cooperation with other jurisdictions, perhaps, sometimes other nations, sometimes members of the private sector, and sometimes members from the NGO sector. But in order to bring those people together, in order for those people to come together and talk to each other and try to work out solutions together, they have to meet, they have to be usually in the same room together, either the physical room or a virtual room. And they do not automatically or magically just happen to be and show up in that same room. Someone has to invite them. Someone needs to say, hey, let's all, come together. We would like to invite you to come and join this effort to address this public problem. And what we have found at the National Policy Consensus Center over the last 20 years is that who invites them and how they invite them matters a great deal in terms of determining the success of that effort. And that's really what I'm here to talk about. Now, oftentimes, when there is a public issue and there is a primary public agency, maybe a national ministry, that is responsible for addressing that issue, it is that ministry or that department or that bureau that says, yes, well, we're the ones who are best able to convene the various parties. But what we have found at the National Policy Consensus Center over these last 20 years is that the other parties who get invited may not see that public agency as the most objective or the most able to, stand outside of their own specific interests and their own specific desire about, seeing a particular solution. Elected leaders have a unique opportunity and a unique ability to play that role, to invite the right key stakeholders together to help address that problem. So I want to now talk a little bit about what that convener role is. I've been using that term, but I really want to explain it a little bit. And it is much more than just being the chair of a meeting. It's also very different from being the facilitator of a meeting. Convening the parties together involves a number of different functions that, if they are played well, as I said before, can really help determine the success of a particular collaborative process. And the first of those roles is, in fact, identifying and inviting key stakeholder groups. Now, it may not be the elected leader, the convener, who actually calls people up and says, hey, I would like you to come to this meeting. Sometimes that happens. But oftentimes there'll be a staff person, there'll be someone who invites people on behalf of. So, the minister would like to invite you to this meeting. So I have been in that role many times where I have called people up, or I've met with people and I've said, I'd like to invite you to this meeting on behalf of this elected leader. So that's the first step, is identifying and inviting the key stakeholder groups. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The second thing, and maybe in my mind the most important thing that the convener can do, and elected leaders are in a great position to do, is to frame the public problem and the essential collaborative task. To explain to people why they are there in that room around the collaborative table, what they're there for, and what their essential task is. Sometimes a way of doing that is acknowledging the difficulty of resolving the issue or resolving the problem. And again, elected leaders are in a really special, good position to be able to do that. Sometimes it's helpful to talk about the history, which may not be quite so pleasant, between some of the parties. And again, elected leaders are in a really good position to be able to talk about that. The third role of a convener is creating trust in the process. And this is one of the reasons why elected leaders, and it isn't always an elected leader. Sometimes you might choose a business leader or an NGO leader. But leaders as a convener, as opposed to an agency or a department, can help create this sense of trust in the process. That, okay, if they're the ones inviting people, if they're the ones who are really framing what our task is, I can trust that this is going to be a fair process. In an impartial forum, that my voice is going to be heard along with everyone else's. Now, it is important to note here that not all elected leaders are necessarily going to be the right person to convene a particular process. And one needs to think about whether or not that elected leader, in fact, has that reputation, that sense, that aura, if you will, of fairness. So they can provide that sense of trust in the process. I will tell you that there have been times when we have had at the National Policy Consensus Center, we've said, oh, well, let's just get this elected leader here, and we have said to ourselves later, that was not the right person. So you have to be thoughtful about this. You have to be strategic about it. The fourth role is what I like to call creating an elevated forum. There are lots of collaborative processes that take place between, departments or ministries, between, different levels of government, between government and business, to talk about things or try to work things out. And there is a difference, a noticeable difference, when in fact an elected leader is the one who says, I would like you to come and I would like you to participate in this particular process. People have a sense when an elected leader does that convening that this is somehow a little different. This is a little more important, perhaps. And perhaps that it will have a little bit higher chance of success. I like to say sometimes that that if you have the right convener, it's like people want to come to that process and be part of that process because it's like, well, it must be we're the cool kids club, It must be like a really cool thing to be in this process. More on that in a moment as well. Let's see. The fifth role is holding the collective interests of the group and all of the participants. So if one is an elected leader and playing that convener role, you are not there as an elected leader to represent your particular jurisdiction and the interests of your jurisdiction. You are there as a convener to hold the interests of the group. Another way of saying that is that you are there holding the interests of the larger community, whether the community is the country, or a province or a state or a smaller unit of government. But you are there holding the interests and sort of representing the interests of the whole community. Occasionally, the convener needs to be a cheerleader, needs to first of all congratulate people for positive things that they do as part of the process. And sometimes the convener needs to be a critic. I was involved in a process once where the convener was actually the president of a prestigious university. And this was an environmental, it was about the restoration of an important river in our state. And you had all of the appropriate stakeholder groups at the table, all of whom had been fighting with each other for decades, actually. And it was a months-long process. And the group came back with its draft report. And I was part of this process. And the convener looked at it and said, really? After months, this is the best we can do? Because what we had done is we had avoided all the difficult questions. We hadn't really done any, conflict resolution. We'd really devolved down to the lowest common denominator, which was something like, the river is really big, and it's really good, and it's really important. That was sort of the gist of our report. And the convener said to us, this isn't good enough. So we went back, and we came back with another draft that was much better, much, much better. So sometimes, now what I will say is that You know, it's difficult. If you're part of a group process, you've been working for months, it's difficult for people to say, well, that's terrible, you know, or that's a lousy idea, you know, because you're very conscious of the relationships in the group. But an elected leader has, the right elected leader, has that sort of moral standing, that status where they can say, no, this isn't good enough. And finally, in a similar vein, challenging the group to do well and sometimes to do better. You know, that by framing the public problem and the essential collaborative task, as I said before, the convener is often the voice of the larger community. And so speaking on its behalf and saying, you know, this is really important and we have to do the best possible work. And sometimes part of that is doing it within a certain period of time, you know, telling people to speed things up a little bit and not take so long. So those are the roles. I'm not sure that that's an exhaustive list, but those are the important roles that I have seen conveners play. And oftentimes, someone appointed as a convener for a particular process, or who has been self-appointed, they might stop at just identifying and inviting the stakeholder groups. And that's as far as they go. Or they might, you know, do that, but also, you know, try to create trust in the process, make sure that the process is fair. But then they leave out all of these other roles. And what they have done is not fully utilize their powers as a convener and as an elected leader. So if you are working with elected officials, or if you are an elected official, you should really think about all of these roles, because all of them can play an important part in the success of the process. I guess I would just add one last thing here on this, which is the kinds of differences that these roles can play in a collaborative process are not just little incremental improvements. They sometimes can produce orders of magnitude improvements in the productivity of a group. So they can make sometimes the difference between whether a group comes to agreement or does not. They can make a difference between whether a group takes 2 months or 12 years in order to get to the solution. And so don't think of these things as just, well, you know, this might be a little 5% improvement. I have seen over and over again, and I'll tell you about some examples in just a few minutes, but I have seen over and over again where the right role by the convener can make a huge difference in the success of the group. Well, let's talk about some of those keys to success, because there are a few. And the first one, as I've already mentioned, is really choosing the right convener. And the way I like to put this is you want someone who can bring the right people to the table and then have them act like grown-ups once they are there. Both of which are important. And elected leaders are in a great position to do both of these things. You know, if a member of our legislature invite someone to the table, you can pretty much bet that they're going to show up. And again, if it's the right person, they're going to be more likely to act like grown-ups, to sort of be on their best behavior once they are there at the table. You want the right combination of credibility, gravitas, and perceived fairness on the issue. So if a certain elected official happens to be a very strong advocate, and everybody knows that they have been a very strong advocate on a particular issue for a particular solution on that issue, they might not be the best convener for that process, because everybody will begin to think, well, you know, this is really just kind of a show here, and the convener's already figured out what the solution is. You know, we're just here as window dressing. Sometimes, however, it's okay if there is a an advocate or known advocate. If, in fact, there are co-conveners, if there's someone else on the other side of that issue, and the two of them together are saying, you know, we don't necessarily agree on this, but we know we have to work together and work this out. And I will tell you in a few moments about a specific example where we did that in Oregon, and with quite amazing results. So that first key to success is being thoughtful about who is the right person to convene, or who are the right parties to convene, who is the right elected leader or leader to convene the process. And again, we have learned sometimes the hard way through our mistakes that you need to be pretty thoughtful about that and pretty strategic. So the second part of success is really identifying who gets invited. You know, who are the right stakeholders to be at the table? And among the questions that one should ask is, who has a stake in the outcome of the deliberations or the project? You know, who has an actual stake? What groups have a stake in this outcome? You might ask whose support or agreement is actually essential to the implementation of whatever solution we come up with. And at times, particularly when you're dealing with kind of collective action collaboration, you probably should be asking who can bring the needed resources, expertise, or authority so that the agreement can be implemented. So those are things that the convener, perhaps with help from staff, should be thinking about. One last thing about identifying the stakeholders. There is at least in the US, and I suspect perhaps in Finland as well, there is a philosophy that you want to try to involve as many people as possible in order to make the process more democratic. And I would argue that you need to maybe rethink that philosophy just a bit for these collaborative processes. Because what the research tells us pretty clearly is that the larger and larger the group, the more difficult it is to get people to agreement. And the easier it is for certain people to kind of hide their own true opinions or feelings. So the approach that I have taken in my practice is to really think about what is the essential topic here? What is the essential issue that needs to be resolved? And who are really the key stakeholders that need to come to agreement on this? And then to think about so who else is there? And maybe what we need to do is to set up, a separate part of the process where we bring certain groups in to talk about what their needs are, or to talk about, what their concerns are, or talk about what information they have. But they aren't necessarily part of the consensus building process itself. So you can, I truly believe that you can have your cake and eat it too in this situation. But I would caution people not to have, groups of, 40, 50 and more people. There may be that many people who have an interest in the outcome. But what we've found is that once you go beyond 20 or 25 people, it gets more difficult. And so there's no fast rule that says, well, you have to cut it off at 15 or you have to cut it off at 25 or whatever. But you should be thinking about that and who really are the essential folks that need to come to agreement in order for the process to move forward. So, the next key to success, and a skill that elected leaders often bring with them, is framing the issue. Essentially saying, this is what we're here to talk about, or this is what we need to resolve. And sometimes it's also about, not only is this the issue, but here is what this group needs to actually do. Here, we're going to need to look at some more information and figure out, what information fits. Or, we're going to need to resolve this conflict between this set of interests and this set of interests. But someone needs to frame the issue for the people so they know why they are there. And there is an art to framing the issue. You are probably not going to participate well in that process. You may even try to, as we say, torpedo that process, and make it not work. So everyone at the table needs to be able to see somehow that their interests could be served in the resolution of the issue. And that's part of the framing. The second piece is that you need to not make it so specific that there's no room for frame something in a way that provides some creative space for solutions maybe that nobody has even thought about as you enter the collaborative process. And the third thing, in many ways I think the most important, is getting to the heart of the issue. At times, I have seen people frame an issue in such a way that everybody's kind of left wondering, huh? What are we talking about here? And the reason that happens is because there's been a history of conflict, and everybody's trying to be really careful and not put some kind of negative slant on the framing. But sometimes what I have found actually is that getting to the heart of the matter and framing the explicit conflicts that have happened actually frees people up. Because oftentimes people are afraid, to talk about what the history is. And people are afraid to talk about what the real conflict is about. And so the process goes on, and it's like some kind of kabuki theater or something, because there's this elephant in the room that nobody talks about. And you can almost feel the pressure sort of building in the room, because everybody kind of knows that there's an issue here that's not really being talked about. So getting to the heart of the matter is not only helpful in moving the process forward, it actually frees people up because they don't have to like hide anything anymore. And they can, you know, they can talk about it. And what I have found is that once you say, yes, well, you know, these people over here, they have this set of interests, and these people over here have this set of interests, and they're in conflict. They don't agree. And we have to sort of work this out. It takes some of the scariness out of it for people. So, framing the issue is, I think, one of the really important skills and one of the important roles that conveners can play and need to play in order for that process to be successful. The next key to success is creating that expectation of success. And this is, I'm going back to the phrase that I used before, which was the elevated forum. Again, the right convener, if they play it right, they are, by their very presence or their very convening of that process, they are implying that this is important. That this is not like every other, you know, cooperative, you know, group gathering. This is somehow different. This is important, and that it has a chance of success because of that, and that I, as an elected leader, I'm sort of putting I am so confident of success. The implication is that I'm putting my political reputation on the line. I'm putting my political name behind this process. And everybody kind of understands that that's what's going on. It doesn't have to be said. And that helps create that, that expectation that, gosh, we might actually be able to make this happen. You know, we might actually be able to work something out here. So this next key is really, it's important. And it's important because elected leaders in particular, first of all, want to take credit for the success because they're going to be running for re-election soon. But they also tend to come to these processes with a feeling like they need to be the one with the solution themselves. And so we have to kind of help them understand, no, they are not the ones who are coming to the table with the solution. They do not have to come up with the solution. They are there to bring the right people together so that those people can together come up with the right solution. The convener, as well as facilitators, I might add, you know, often take on too much responsibility themselves. And what I find is that when that happens, if a convener feels and acts like they are responsible for the success or not success of the group, then the group sits back like this and says, okay, let's see, you know, let's watch you come up with, you know, the right solution. Let's see what you can do. That's not what you want to see happen. You know, the convener should be putting the responsibility on the group. You know, if there's an issue to be resolved, the convener should be the one who says, well, what are you going to do about it? You know, how are you going to resolve this particular issue? I probably shouldn't do this, but I'll just give you a little side story here. I was not acting as a convener, but the principle is the same. I was working with two local governments in Oregon who had been fighting over drinking water and how the drinking water was to be produced. And one was the municipality, the town government, and the other was the county government, which is a unit of the state, subunit of the state. And so I brought the two representatives together, and I listened through the morning as they, both of them were saying, well, this is the way it should be. And the other was like, no, this is the way it should be. No, this is the way it should be. And they went back and forth like that for 3 hours in the morning. And we came back after lunch, and I said to them, okay, you have said that these are your reasons for why you take this position, and you over here, you've given these reasons for your position. And I said, they're both legitimate reasons. You're both right, but they're not compatible, right? They're in conflict. And you all have to live together here. So I said, so what are you going to do? Now remember that they had been talking back and forth for 3 hours in the morning. So I asked the question, so, how are you going to resolve this? And there was this uncomfortable silence for about, it seemed like, an hour, but it was probably more like 20 seconds. And one of them said, well, we could do this, and they laid out a plan. And the other party kind of looked at the one guy and they said, really, you would support that? I think we could support that. And they literally resolved it themselves. I didn't have to do anything except kind of put the responsibility on them. I think they had been hoping that I was going to tell them who was right and who was wrong, right? And I didn't do that. I said, how are you going to work it out? And that is really the role that the convener can play as well, and put the responsibility on the group. I think last in my keys to success is sharing the success and recognition. And what I find is that one of the barriers to collaboration, one of the barriers that prevents organizations, either in the public sector or even the NGO sector and the business sector, from embracing a collaborative approach from the beginning, is because they want to be able to take credit for the solution. And they're worried that if it's a collaborative effort that they get lost, right? So one of the roles of the convener, and particularly a role that elected officials can play, is simply giving credit where credit is due. When people perform in particularly cooperative ways, for that to get called out. When, the cameras are rolling and they are celebrating their successes, that each of those jurisdictions, each of the representatives from particular organizations are able to have their few minutes in the spotlight and get credit for being part of the successful collaborative effort. It's really important, and it is something that elected leaders are particularly able to do. If your legislative representative is the one saying, good work to you, to this organization for their contribution or the compromises they made or their collaborative behavior in this process, that means a lot to people. So elected leaders have an opportunity not only to sometimes be a critic, but also to share the recognition and the success of the collaborative process. So I've been talking about what the convener does and how the convener can be successful. But elected leaders, in particular, they're busy people. And I've been talking about a lot of different roles and a lot of different things that they can do. So it is important that that convener be supported by someone. Sometimes it is, someone like in the role of a courtie. Sometimes it is, maybe a staff person from one of the public agencies. And sometimes it's a shared kind of role. But there needs to be, and you need to think about how you support that convener in playing that role. So as I said before, sometimes the inviting of people to the table, the actual phone call is not being done by the convener, but it's being done on behalf of the convener by someone else. It is important, and boy, I want to stress, it is very important that, over the course of weeks or months, things happen, things change, circumstances change. It's really important that the convener not be surprised and embarrassed about certain changes. So someone needs to keep that convener or conveners, informed of any major developments, particularly if they are negative developments, but positive developments as well. And to communicate in advance what is needed from the convener. The convener may have 20, different issues on their plate, as we say in the U.S., at any given time. And this is only maybe one of them. So they need to be reminded, okay, remember where we left off was, we had this issue that needed to get worked out. I often, particularly if a convener is going to be present at a meeting of the collaborative group, I will often give that convener an annotated agenda that has, places where they can play a role and what that role might be to help move the group forward. So communicating in advance, what you really need, how the convener can play one of those roles that we talked about before at any given moment during the process. And to really utilize the convener's time strategically. So we had a process that I will talk a little bit more about here in a few moments around forest management in Oregon. And the person who was convening or who was asked to convene that collaborative process to work out some very tough issues was our governor's natural resources advisor, so the main head of the natural resources part of the agenda for the governor. And the person, so we're talking to that person, and the person is saying, yeah, I don't think I can do this. I have too many things going on here. And we said, well, we can think of a way in which you can be maybe even more effective by not being present at all these meetings, but to sort of come in strategically. And well, actually, I've gone this far. I might as well tell you the story. So what we said to him is, if your time is limited, if you show up to the first meeting and you help frame what the issue is and what you expect from the group, what the group's work really is. One of the things that you could do is to say, I'm going to be back here in 4 weeks, and here's what I want to see. I want to see, an agreement on these 3 issues. And that's all you have to say. And then you don't have to be involved at all. You can come back in 4 weeks, and just your saying those words will help spur this group to success. And it turns out it worked. It's important to recognize that elected leaders are very, very busy people, and to use their time strategically. On the other hand, it is critically important for the convener to communicate through their actions, maybe their words, that this particular process, this particular issue, is actually a high priority for them. Because if the message comes across as, yeah, well, I was appointed to sort of convene you all together, but I've got way more important things to do, and I'm not really that interested, then you lose most, if not all, of the value of that person convening the group together. So it's a balancing act. You have to respect the convener's time, the elected officials' time, but they also need to communicate by their words and actions that this is an important project or an important process, an important issue for them. So, I'd like to talk about a few examples. I won't go into a lot of detail about these, but these particular examples, I think, are helpful to show some of the things that I've been talking about. So we had a project in Oregon to develop, which would have been the first, I think, on the West Coast, it may have been the second on the West Coast, wave energy development a number of years ago. And among the interests at stake in this process was that state government wanted to, begin building a more sustainable energy future. It was very important to the state. But obviously, we're talking about wave energy. You're in the ocean. You're on the coast of Oregon, which means that there are fishing interests that you need to take into consideration. There are other sort of local economic concerns that you need to take into consideration. And so the other set of interests, sometimes opposing, were really from the local community perspective. So in developing this collaborative process to work out these issues, we had a state legislator, a member of the state legislature, who was highly respected, and a local public official co-convene. And again, the message was, we understand that we have sort of separate interests here. We have some common interests, but we have some separate interests, and we together want to invite you all to, come together and try to work these issues through. And because you had both the local government person and the state government person co-convening, you had the community of interests in each of those spheres thinking, okay, I can see my interests being served in some way through this solution. I can see that this is going to be, a fair process. And so we got, again, very, very good participation. So that was the power of thinking through strategically who is the right person to make sure that there is trust in the process. Second example is Columbia River water and irrigation. And the issue in an agricultural part of the state was it's actually a very dry part of the state, but the very large Columbia River goes through that part of the state. And farmers already were, taking some of that river water and using it for irrigation. But they wanted more. And if in fact they got some more water from the river for irrigation, they would be able to grow a lot more crops, which would result in a lot more employment in that rural area. And in Oregon, in the rural areas, employment was a very, very important thing. Economic viability was a very, very high priority. But one of the most important issues in Oregon, you might be able to relate to this, is the survivability and the sustainability of salmon runs. And you had the environmental community saying, you're already taking more water from the Columbia River than you should, and the salmon need that water to make it out to the sea. And if you take more water, it's going to have a negative impact on the salmon runs, and it's going to further contribute to the decline and maybe the extinction of our native salmon runs. And that's not a good thing. And we are certainly not going to support that. So that was the issue. Each of them, by the way, sort of framed and defined the project as convincing the other side that they were wrong, right? And that their own perspective should be the one that prevails. So the governor's office convened this process and invited these stakeholders to the table. And how the governor framed the issue was, let's see if there are ways in which we can both support healthier salmon runs, not just keep the status quo, but support restoration of salmon, and somehow provide more water for irrigation. And the governor went further and said, by the way, if you are able to come up with some solutions here, and they were, if you're able to come up with some solutions, I will support those solutions with money in the next legislative session. I will advocate for whatever you come up with if you can come to a consensus on what those solutions are, and if it meets those criteria of supporting salmon runs and supporting greater irrigation for agriculture. So that is an example of where the convener framed the issue perfectly and then went further really to provide, because of he was an elected official, using his power to provide that incentive for people to come up with that consensus. And I might add, when we went into it, I'm not sure anybody actually thought that they could be successful and they could actually come up with anything that was a solution, but in fact they ended up agreeing, having a consensus on, I think, a five-point plan. The next project that I want to talk about, and all these, by the way, are from the state of Oregon on the west coast of the U.S. But this was an interesting one where there was an historic area in Oregon that was about to be celebrated. There were two early explorers, Lewis and Clark, who were sort of, among the first European descendant explorers of Oregon. And they were camped at a certain point on the Oregon coast for, I think, a year and a half or something, or maybe it was a year. And there was going to be the 200-year birthday of this, and there was going to be this huge national celebration of this in Oregon. And so the fort where they had been camped out was about, I'm going to say 4 miles, 3 miles maybe from the actual ocean. And someone had this idea of reestablishing the trail that they had used to get from their fort to the sea. But it had to happen very quickly because the celebration was like a year and a half away, and the trail was not there any longer. And the proposed trail went across about 4 different ownerships of property. So there's a lot of cooperation and collaboration that needed to happen. And there was not necessarily agreement on how that should work. So there was a very charismatic, colorful, you might say, elected official in that area. Her name was Betsy Johnson. She was a state senator. And she was the convener for this effort. And as soon as she was appointed convener, let me tell you, when she invited people to the table, they showed up. Partly they showed up because they did not want to make her mad at them, let me tell you. And so, and she was an advocate for the trail, but she wasn't an advocate for any, particular way that the trail got built. She just wanted to see the trail built. And it was actually quite an amazing collaborative project. This group of, private landowners, private sector, like engineers and landscape architects, et cetera, as well as the local government and the state government and the federal government. They all sort of came together and they got the trail built. Was one of our program's early great successes. But it was the convener and the convener's personality. It was not just that she was a state senator, although that helped. But she was there sort of representing the community, and she said, hey, come on, the community needs us, the state needs us, the local community needs us to do this. And so I'm putting the responsibility on all of you, she said, to make sure that this happens in some way. And it did. This next one is probably my favorite, and I alluded to it earlier. I don't know whether the initials GMO have the same meaning in Finland or not, but it's in English it stands for genetically modified organisms. And there's a lot of use of genetically modified organisms in agriculture. However, not everybody is on board with the use of genetically modified organisms. And not all farmers are on board with the use of genetically modified organisms. And many of the farmers who are not happen to have their fields planted downwind from those who do use genetically modified organisms, and so they're worried about, the cross-fertilization that might happen. If you don't understand this already, you need to hear this. This is close to a religious war for some folks. These people on either side of this issue are not, kind of laissez-faire about this issue at all. They are very, very strong advocates. And to say that they don't agree is, an understatement. Even to say they don't like each other because of their respective positions would be an understatement. This really was for many people like a holy war. I mean, some people who were involved in this issue, this is what their life was about. This was their crusade, if you will. So the legislature, which had to try to resolve this issue in some way, said to itself, oh, we don't want to get in the middle of this, so let's have the National Policy Consensus Center convene a group of people and see if we can get this resolved in some way. So we worked with the legislature, and we decided that the best way of approaching this was with co-conveners. And the co-conveners in this case were not elected officials, but one of them was, but they were both university-based, so they were both university leaders. One was the head of the state's agricultural university, and the other was the head of the urban center's sustainability institute. And what was interesting to see what happened is that these two co-conveners, very, very smart, very highly respected people, convened the parties together, and what they said at the first meeting was, the two of us don't necessarily agree on this. We have some different opinions about what we think should happen. But what we do agree on is that we need to work this out. And we need your help in working this out. And so, as co-conveners, they were able to lay out the task for the group. And in this case, the task was to sort of lay out these issues for the state legislature. To, in a sense, agree on where they disagreed, as well as where they could agree. And it was one of the most instructive processes that I have observed in my 20-plus years in this field, because these people could barely speak to each other at the beginning, barely speak to each other. By the end of the process, where they had come to a consensus on what they wanted to say to the legislature, they were hugging each other. People who couldn't talk to each other at the beginning were hugging each other at the end of the process. And I am positive that that would never have happened had we not had those two co-conveners, and if those two co-conveners had not framed the issue in the way they did, and the task of the group in the way they did. So it was probably the biggest turnaround I have ever seen of any collaborative group, from the highest level of conflict to not necessarily agreeing on everything, but being able to come to consensus on a report that they were going to provide for the state legislature. I've already mentioned this one, so I won't say too much about it, but this is the one where the governor's advisor was the convener, and you know, he was saying, gosh, I just don't, you know, this is important, but I've got a whole bunch of other things that I have to do. I can't go to every meeting. And where we said, okay, as a convener, you can lay out the challenge for the group. You can lay out your expectations of the group. And it was almost better because by doing it this way, the convener put the responsibility on them rather than taking the responsibility himself. And it worked. And it worked. Okay. I think this is the last one. And this was a project that I worked on personally. There was, you know, I mentioned the major river in Oregon. This is that river. It's called the Willamette River, and it goes through my city, the city of Portland. As it begins to go through that city, there's a big waterfall, and there were a historic series of locks so that river traffic could go up and down the river. And the locks were operated by the federal government. Don't ask me to go into all the reasons why, but it was operated by an agency called the Army Corps of Engineers of the federal government. And it was well over 100 years old, and they had not put a lot of money into maintenance of the locks, and they were sort of dilapidated, and the Corps of Engineers said, yeah, we're going to just shut these down. So a group of people were like, well, you know, you can't shut it down. You're going to turn one river into two rivers, at least navigation-wise, and we want to continue to be able to go up and down the river. So so they came to us, to the National Policy Consensus Center, and I, talked with them. And in this case, it was not an elected official, but it was a former elected official, someone who had retired from the state legislature. One of the most respected political figures in the state, and maybe the most respected in terms of his sort of sense of fairness, the sense that he was really willing to listen to everyone. He happened to be a Republican who worked with Democrats as easily as he worked with Republicans. He had established that reputation. So he brought that reputation to his role as the convener. And one of my reasons for wanting to talk about this is to talk about the elevated forum, right? To talk about how someone of that stature, as a convener, can elevate people's sense of what this is about. And my favorite story about this project is that at the first meeting, the convener framed the issue initially as, okay, there are a lot of parties here who see it as in their interest, and in many cases in their financial interest, to keep these locks operating. And that's going to take some money. And that money has to come from somewhere. But there are enough of you in the room who have an interest that if you all put in sort of your fair share, you know, there are enough resources represented in this room to keep the locks open. Well, the federal government, this agency for the federal government that owned and operated the locks, came to the first meeting and said, yes, well, that's all nice, but we can't accept any money from anyone. And there was like this moment of silence. This was the first meeting of the group. And everybody's like looking at each other like, okay, are we done? You know, let's, you know, should we go home? And so the convener said, I think what needs to happen next is we don't need to go too much further today, but why don't a subgroup of us meet with the agency next week, and we'll get more detail on this and talk it through, so that then when we meet again, you know, we'll kind of understand this a little bit better, and we can, you know, go forward in some way. Because of who that convener was, his name was Vern Duncan, because of who he was, one of the parties at the table was also a U.S. senator's office, not the senator himself, but you know, somebody representing his office. There were a lot of important people in that room, and and I was the project manager. I was the facilitator for the project. I will tell you, I was not happy with the federal agency because they never told me this, you know, as we were sort of planning the meeting ahead of time. So I was like, I had probably lost some of my objectivity at that point. I was not very happy with them. But I and the convener and the senator's office and maybe one or two other people, a week later, we walk into the office for the federal agency to meet with them to sort of get some more detail about this. So what do you think might have happened? Well, we walked in and we sat down, and we were sort of ready to start asking questions and so forth, and they said, well, we have an announcement to make. We figured out a way for this to happen. And they had decided on their own that maybe they need to rethink their position. Given the level of people who were participating in this process. And the level of people participating in this process were there because of the respect for the convener. So it's actually one of my favorite memories of the last 25 years of just how quickly that happened, because it was a very short meeting. We said thank you very much, and everybody shook hands, and that process ultimately has led now to a change in ownership of the locks and millions of dollars of investment into rehabilitating the locks so that they can continue to operate. So a happy ending to what was a really bad beginning to that story. So I think I'm going to stop there. Those are some examples that I think hopefully can illustrate some of the power that elected leaders can bring as a convener, not as decision makers, not as advocates, but as conveners for a collaborative process. So I will stop there and maybe open it up for questions.
Thank you, Steve. That was wonderful. What we will do is have a couple of questions from the room before we have Henrik's comment speech. So Anni has a mic there, and when you ask for the mic, would you please introduce yourself first, so that others know where the comment is coming from?
Thank you very much. This is very inspiring, I think. My name is Mia Toikka. I am a doctoral researcher in the University of Vaasa, and I also have some background in various policy processes also. And as you present this, it all seems very intuitive and kind of self-evident or obvious that this is the way we should go about it. And I'm wondering that how can we overcome the partisan political agendas or the positions, especially in this era of very kind of polarized culture of political conversations, I guess both in the US and in Finland, in many other countries. I think that finding the non-partisan people there is not very simple, possibly. So I'm sure you have some experience of that. It would be nice to hear from that also.
Yes, it's a great question. You know, we in the U.S. you may be aware, in the U.S. we have our own experiences with hyperpartisanship, and it is why I think it's important to be very strategic about what elected leaders you are using for a convener. Because I can think of many elected leaders in the US who I would never have, you know, as a convener for a collaborative process. I won't name any names, but you probably can imagine yourself. And but there are people who can play that role. I also would say that it is one of the reasons why we sometimes have co-conveners, you know, so that, but that requires the co-conveners to be on the same page, not necessarily about the solution to begin with, but about the process, and that it is important to work out those differences. I often say in a collaborative process, and Lasse and Jona and I have talked about this, that the problem with some of these collaborative processes is that people come and they're not really looking for agreement, they're looking for victory, right? And you need to find conveners and maybe in some ways coach those conveners so that they can get people and move them away from seeking victory to seeking agreement. And part of that framing is so critical about you know, acknowledging that there are strong differences sometimes. And you know, something I didn't talk about, but it is also really critical, and it's something that the right convener can help with or acknowledge, is that even people who represent a certain constituency, even if they have participated in a collaborative process and they've learned to trust the other person, and they want to sort of form this agreement, but they have these other people who they have to go report to, and those people are saying, are you crazy? You know, you can't make a deal with these people over here. So I guess I want to first acknowledge that it is a problem. You know, the hyper-partisanship is a problem, and you know, it's certainly a problem in our country. And but again, being strategic about you know, the right person. Maybe also the idea of using a retired, you know, elected leader who doesn't have to get votes or doesn't have to get money to get votes, you know, they have more freedom. And you find sometimes that people who used to be elected leaders who are now no longer, you know, in that position, somehow they seem like they become much more statesman-like or stateswoman-like, right? You know, and you wonder where that person was when they were actually serving the public. So that's something I would think about. I also would think about, you know, in terms of co-conveners, not necessarily that you have to have people both who are, you know, elected leaders, but maybe an elected leader and someone who is a business leader. Because sometimes there's a little bit of maybe discipline that happens when you have those different sectors involved in a process. So I don't want to imply that there's an easy answer to your question, only that you have to be thoughtful about it. Yeah.
I also want to thank you for the very captivating presentation. I'm Tiia Merenheimo from Motiva, which is a state-owned company promoting sustainable transformation in Finland.
Okay.
And my question is related to the previous one. I think I need to give some background. I work with municipalities a lot, and with their, especially with their climate efforts, and mainly with the office holding, like employees of the municipalities. And I often hear them say that they're worried or their job is made difficult by the elected leaders in the municipality really disagreeing a lot. They have maybe agreed on the, let's say, a climate effort, a carbon neutrality goal or something, but then they disagree a lot on the means and so on. And my question is if this is a situation in a municipality where the, let's say, the elected leaders are very, very disagreeing, and then there are people, for example, working in like office holding employees of the municipality, how could they get started if there is not a culture of convening or not an outside facilitator or something? Can anyone initiate, say we need a convener and start looking for someone maybe in the elected leaders or somewhere else, or is it always a question of reaching out for help of some kind of facilitator to help them with that?
Couldn't you get some easier questions? Well, first of all, that's a problem. I mean, it's and sometimes the circumstances are not conducive to a collaborative effort. One of the things that I think about is if I were in your position, I might go to that elected leader and say, you know, it feels like we have this issue that we need to resolve in some way, and that a collaborative effort might be useful. Who do you think would be the right person to bring those people together? So if you get some ownership of the process, not the solution, but the process, by that troublesome elected leader, you know, maybe that would help. That would be the first thing I would think about. Well, the first thing I would think about is this going to work at all, right? Are they even open to, you know, possible solutions? If they're not, I'm one of those people who says, don't waste people's time if it's not going to be successful. You know, if you know right from the get-go that it's not going to work, I'm very careful about that, because because I would say the majority of people are very skeptical about whether this collaboration stuff is, realistic. And if you create a process that you know from the beginning has a very small chance of success, you are only reinforcing that notion that this is all just, show, and it's not really effective. And so I'm always very careful about that. But then having said that, one of the things I might do is go to one of those key, or maybe more than one, key legislator or public official, and say, who do you think might be able to bring folks together? The danger in doing that is they might say, me, right? So you have to be a little careful about that as well.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I'm Samuli Laita from the Finnish Future Fund, Sitra. It's organization we call ourselves as a Think and Do and Connect tank operating under the Finnish Parliament.
I like that, by the way. I haven't heard that before, and I like that. I think and do think.
In the global scale, I would say. One of the questions it came to my mind when you were talking about the GMO case. So you said that conveners were from the universities.
Yes. And
so did they recognize themselves as possible conveners before, or should you... convince them that they could be conveners, and what's the situation in that kind of conflicts, which are so-called frozen conflicts, that people are not aware that we should move forward, actually?
Yeah, that's a great question. In Oregon, for one of our programs, at least, and really both of our programs at the National Policy Consensus Center that operate in Oregon, the governor, or sometimes the legislature, will appoint someone. But in the absence of that, so the governor will say, I would like you and you to convene this process because I think you could do a good job. Now, the governor sometimes thinks of that on her own or his own, but oftentimes the governor says that after we've thought through and talked to people and found out, who might be able to serve that role. But in the absence of that, there's a joke in American slang, which is, who died and made you God? So the convener has to have some credibility for convening. And they can be self-selected. I am going to answer your question. I'm moving toward the answer. But they can be self-selecting and say, I'm going to get together with Jonna, and we're going to invite these people together because we can do this. We have the kind of the moral authority and the stature to do that. But they do have to sort of think through, again, are they the right ones? And do they have the ability to bring the right people to the table and have them act like grown-ups once they are there? In the case of the GMO folks, they were appointed by the governor. But they did not hesitate. And in the absence of the governor's appointment, and in fact the governor appointed them because we suggested to the governor that on a scientific issue like genetically modified organisms, that having the university presence would be helpful, would provide that sort of moral authority to bring the various people to the table. And what we said was having these two perspectives together would be useful. We had to actually then bring them together and say, you know, would you be willing to do this if this other person was the co-convener? They did not hesitate. They said, yes, absolutely. And they, in fact, looked forward to it. So it is a, it's not always an easy path. It's not always an easy decision who should be the right one to bring people together. But again, and I know it sounds like sort of humorous or a jargon, but I really do think to myself, who can bring the right people to the table? If they invite them, will they show up? And will they act like grown-ups once they are there? And those two people were able to do that.
Thank you, Steve. For now, you can take a seat, and we will watch commentary by Henrik Wikström. And after that, we have still plenty of time for questions, then maybe inspired also by his comments. The commentary will be in Finnish language.
Hei teille kaikille. Mun nimi on Henrik Wikström ja mä oon ensimmäisen kauden kansanedustaja ja myöskin kunnanhallituksen puheenjohtaja Inkoossa. Mulla on suuri ilo ja kunnia sanoa muutama sananen tästä äsken kuulemastamme esityksestä liittyen juuri vihreän siirtymän hankkeisiin. Haluan ensiksi kertoa teille lyhyesti, että millainen tausta minulla poliitikkona on liittyen juuri vihreän siirtymän hankkeisiin. Meillä Inkoossa on tällä hetkellä vireillä Blaster Green Steelin hanke, joka julkaistiin viime vuoden alkupuolella. Ja Blasterin tavoitteena on rakentaa Inkooseen vihreä terästehdas. Tämän hankkeen kautta olen päässyt tutustumaan aika hyvin siihen, että millaista on käsitellä aika pienellä paikkakunnalla Inkoossa näin mittavaa hanketta, joka on merkityksellinen niin alueen, mutta ennen kaikkea Suomen näkökulmasta. Haluan ensin kuitenkin aloittaa hieman valtakunnan politiikasta, koska kuten myöskin tämänhetkisessä hallitusohjelmassa, niin vihreä siirtymä on todella tärkeä asia koko Suomelle. Suurin syy tähän liittyy siihen, että meidän puhdas energiamme on todella halpaa verrattuna moneen muuhun verrokkimaahan. Ja juuri nyt meillä on sauma myöskin edistää monia hankkeita, koska monet maat Euroopassa, kuten Saksa ja myöskin muut Pohjoismaat, ovat lähteneet taktisesti kilpailemaan enemmän tällä vihreällä sektorilla. Ja mikäli me emme nyt hyödynnä meidän mahdollisuuksiamme, niin voi olla, että nämä kaikki hankkeet, jotka on nyt tällä hetkellä Suomessa vireillä, niin menee muihin maihin. Tämä siis tarkoittaa, että paine valtakunnallisesti edistää näitä vihreän siirtymän hankkeita niin on todella kova. Mutta on todella myöskin tärkeää, että paikallisväestö ymmärtää, mistä näistä hankkeista on kyse. Muistan hyvin silloin, kun tämä hanke ensimmäinen kertaa uutisoitiin Inkoon suhteen, niin silloin elettiin tammikuuta 2023. Ja moni kuntalainen oli hieman ihmeissään ja hämmentynyt siitä, että millä tavalla Helsingin Sanomat niin pääsivullaan kertoo tästä mittavasta hankkeesta, jonka siis investointivaikutus olisi jo noin 4 miljardia euroa, niin miten ihmeessä voi tulla Inkooseen. Tällaisen ehkä pienen positiivisen hämmennyksen jälkeen niin aika kului ja kaavahanke lähti vireille ja myöskin sitten ympäristölupaprosessit lähti liikenteeseen, eli YVA-vaikutusten arviointi. Ja kun tuo hanke eteni ja ensimmäinen YVA-tilaisuus järjestettiin elokuussa 2023, niin silloin Inkoossa myöskin alkoi kritiikki tätä hanketta kohtaa kasvamaan. Ja sen jälkeen niin vastustus on kasvanut hanketta kohtaan, mutta osaltaan aika moni inkoolainen kokee myöskin, että tämä hanke on todella tärkeä. Ja myöskin seudun muut paikkakunnat kokevat, että tällainen hanke, joka toisi 1000 työpaikkaa, niin olisi kunnalle hyvin tärkeä. Koska me kaikki tiedämme, että maaseudulla niin pienet kunnat kamppailevat elonjäämisestään. Väestö ikääntyy ja talouden suhtanteet niin eivät ole kunnille tällä hetkellä kovinkaan hyvät. Tällaisessa tilanteessa, niin missä me olemme myöskin Inkoossa, niin voi lyhyesti sanoa, niin meillä löytyy monennäköisiä erilaisia konflikteja. Meillä löytyy konflikti tietenkin erilaisten toimijoiden kanssa Inkoon sisällä. Yritys haluaisi mennä nopeasti eteenpäin yhdessä maanomistajan kanssa kaavahankkeessa, joka on vireillä, ja samaan aikaan kuntalaiset janoavat tietoja. Päättäjänä tällaisessa aika konfliktisessa tilanteessa niin on hyvin haastavaa toimia, koska samaan aikaan kun pitäisi ennen kaikkea huolehtia siitä, että kunnan omat intressit näkyvät kaikessa tekemisessä, niin täytyy myöskin huomioida se tosiasia, että tämä hanke on valtakunnallisesti merkittävä ja loppupeleissä niin meidänkin pienellä kunnalla niin ei ole kovinkaan paljon sanottavaa siinä, että tuleeko tämä hanke menemään eteenpäin, mutta toki meillä on kaavoitusmonopoli, eli mikäli me emme kaavaa hyväksy, niin hanke ei mene eteenpäin. Itse kun olen tutustunut tähän aiemmin kuulemamme tällaiseen uuteen tapaan miettiä ja ratkaista tällaisia konflikteja, niin pidän oikein hyvänä avauksena. Itse olen oppinut siitä, että paras ja keskeisintä tällaisessa vihreän siirtymän hankkeessani on 2 asiaa. Yksi liittyy viestintään ja toinen liittyy sitten suoraan vuorovaikutukseen. Tässä ehkä Inkon hankkeessa kävi sellainen haaste, että tämä viestintä alkuvaiheessa niin ei ollut niin hyvää. Oli todella vaikea kuntalaisilla luoda tämmöinen selkeä mielikuva siitä, mitä tässä ollaan tekeillä. Silloin helposti syntyy sellainen tilanne, että myöskin väärä info lähtee leviämään eteenpäin ja sitä kautta sitten muodostuu myöskin väärä kuva monelle tästä hankkeesta. Toinen liittyy tähän vuorovaikutukseen ja siksi olen myöskin hyvin kiinnostunut tästä Oregonin mallista ja olen myöskin miettinyt, että millä tavalla me voitaisiin myöskin Inkoossa lähteä hyödyntämään sitä. Koska nyt on selkeästi nähtävissä, että meillä löytyy moni huolestunut kuntalainen, jotka vastustaa hanketta. Samaan aikaan meillä löytyy kuntalaisia, jotka puoltavat hanketta. Meillä löytyy myöskin sitten yritys, joka todellakin edistää tätä yhdessä maanomistajan kanssa. Tällaisessa tilanteessa niin itse pidän hyvänä ajatuksena juuri sitä, että me poliitikot ja myöskin sitten kunta pystyisi toimimaan mahdollisimman neutraalina toimijana tässä. Meidän pitäisi olla se toimija, johon jokainen pystyy luottamaan ja ennen kaikkea meidän täytyy varmistua siitä, että kuntalaiset sekä he, jotka puoltavat tätä hanketta, mutta myöskin vastustavat tätä hanketta, niin ovat myöskin sitten sanotaanko, tai kokevat, että kunta on neutraali osapuoli, jotta asioita saadaan edistettyä. Nyt Inkoossa me ollaan todella haastavan tilanteen edessä, koska meillä on ensi vuonna kuntavaalit, jotka myöskin vaikuttaa poliittiseen keskusteluun, mutta itse ainakin tästä selvityksestä ja tästä kuulemastamme niin tulen ottamaan myöskin paljon ajatuksia meidän työhömme, koska meidän hanke on tällä hetkellä kesken. Meidän luonnos on ollut nähtävillä ja nyt me odotetaan kommentteja siihen ja tämän jälkeen niin meidän nyt tehtävänä on sitten istua alas ja pohtia, että millä tavalla me viemme tätä kokonaisuutta yhdessä eteenpäin. Mutta se, mikä on tärkeä asia, niin olisi se, että meidän valtakunnallisesti pitäisi puhua paljon enemmän siitä, että kuinka tärkeää on se, että nämä vihreän siirtymän hankkeet myöskin tuntuvat paikallisväestöltä hyvältä. Koska jos tulee se mielikuva paikallisväestölle, että tänne vain tullaan ja te ette saa mitään hyötyä tästä, niin se ei ole oikea lähtökohta. Sen takia on hyvä lähteä miettimään, että millä tavalla ehkä me paikallisyhteisön keskeisenä toimijana eli kuntana niin voidaan viedä neutraalisti erilaisia toimijoita yhteen keskustelemalla, löytää yhteisiä kompromisseja siitä, millä tavalla asioita voitaisiin viedä eteenpäin. Näistä asioista ei ole valtakunnallisesti vielä puhuttu niinkään paljon, mutta itse toivon, että myöskin näitä ajatuksia, joista me tänään ollaan kuultu, niin voitaisiin keskustella enemmän valtakunnallisesti, jotta mitkään keskeiset yritysinvestoinnit eivät kaatuisi siihen, että itse prosessi niin ei ole ollut hyvä ja ei ole herättänyt luottamusta.
No niin, kiitos Henrik Wikström. Nyt voidaan käyttää puheenvuoroja suomeksi tai englanniksi, jos halutaan, että Steve ymmärtää, mitä sanotte. Meillä on edelleen aikaa tuommoinen 15 minuuttia ja voi myöskin ottaa tähän uusia avauksia. Eli nyt meillä on monipuolinen kattaus teemoja tässä, niin löytyykö kommentaattoreita? Lasse, ole hyvä, ja sitten Rauno.
Yes, hello. My name is Lasse Peltonen. I'm a professor of environmental governance and conflict resolution at University of Eastern Finland and also co-founder at Accordio. And wanted to thank Steve for your great talk and very clear presentation about the convener role. And one observation that I have made through some of our research work is that in Finland, probably in many other countries as well, there are a lot of kind of working groups where stakeholders are kind of invited to work on something. And it's not always that clear how the work is supposed to be conducted. So we have been researching, for instance, the protection of the Saimaa ringed seal in Finland lately, and which kind of falls interestingly under the mandates of first the Ministry of Environment, who is in charge of the protection of the seal, but then the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry is in charge of the fisheries regulation, and fisheries is a key component in the fate of the Saimaa ringed seal. So there are these two ministries, and we've been doing some research on these kind of the working groups and how they are operating. And currently we're also with a PhD student, Matias Sivonen, we are kind of working together with the regional ELY center in Etelä-Savo in the Saimaa region to kind of helping them to design the work of this Saimaa ring seal protection strategy working group, which is a very big group, but in order for them to, for instance, have ground rules to work by and so on. But just coming back to the observation is that I think that there are a lot of different working groups that kind of they are chaired by an official, usually by, let's say, a ministry has a working group, it's chaired by an official, but beyond that there's actually the kind of convener role is often missing, and it's more like for instance, the Saimaa fishing statutes group was kind of convened under the auspices of the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, and there's one official in that working group who's chairing the meetings. But the observation from our side was that like in this group, but also I'm sure in many others, the kind of group is kind of led by the chair of the group, but there are no other like particular roles in terms of convening or facilitating the group work. So a lot of groups are kind of left at their own devices to work, and there's kind of an expectation that once we get everybody together and talk, then consensus will somehow emerge, which of course it does not. Yeah. And a lot of times there are kind of dissenting opinions from the reports and stuff like that. And so I really appreciated what Steve you said that and pointed out that building kind of the possibility for consensus can be designed in the process. Convening is one tool. It can also be incentivized by the convener. So for instance, if you find agreement, I will find extra funds to actually implement that agreement. And those kinds of tools I think are very seldom present in our Finnish in the kind of working of these different groups. So I think that's I think for that reason, I really appreciated your talk. Maybe a more specific question is that once you were talking about the convener role, but then you also mentioned you were yourself facilitating some of these groups. So can there be a convener role in a group without a supporting facilitator role in a group, or so does there need to be kind of a host or some particular specific roles, a set of different roles in order to enable this kind of collaboration to work? So would one of these groups fly only by the convening of the convener only?
Yes. You know, it reminds me, again, I will answer your question, but by way of answering your question, I often will talk to people about their process, and they'll say, well, we don't have a convener. There is no convener. And what I say to them is, no, you're wrong about that. There may not be an intentionality around the convening. There may not be a very good assumption of that role, but these people did not magically show up in the room together. You know, someone had to invite them. And that is not the only part of convening, but that is certainly, you know, a role that is played. That is part of the convening role. So I try to tell people, you don't tell me that there is no convener, because there's always a convener. That may not be well played, but there is always a convener. And the point that I try to make is, wouldn't it be helpful to be intentional about it? Wouldn't it be helpful to really think through what are all of those roles that a convener can do to help make a process more successful? It's hard enough to get a group that disagrees with each other to come to an agreement. And without that convener, it's just much, much more difficult. Having said that, my real answer to your question, Lasse, is it all depends. I mean, it depends on the issue, depends on how big, depends on how long the process is going to be. Sometimes, I talked before about the role that I played as a facilitator or a mediator, really, for those two local government groups. When I put it back on them, when I said, I framed the issue, here's your position, here's your position. The problem is that you can't have both of those things at the same time, so what are you going to do about it? I framed the issue and I put the responsibility on them. In that way, I was actually playing a convening kind of role. And so for very complex projects, we often will have a facilitator, we bring in someone like Accordi, to mediate or facilitate. And we also have a convener. We might also have, a group that would be assigned to be providing staff support, to do research and things like that, or to make contacts, of people when or set up meetings, etc. But that's, when we have some fairly sophisticated and fairly complex processes. You may recall I've already talked to you maybe 4 years ago about this, where I once actually played a convener role when there was an issue within the state because there was a company, a Japanese company, as it turns out, that had a location in Oregon, and they were having problems. And we had one state agency saying one thing and another state agency saying something else. And so I brought the two agencies together, and I said, because I was working at the governor's office at the time, and so I brought them together, and I said, okay, here's the problem here. How are you going to work it out? And they each looked at each other, and they kind of said, well, I thought you were going to do this, and the other was like, well, I thought you were going to do this, and they worked it out like in 15 minutes. Problem solved. And so that didn't require a lot of anything, but it did require a framing of the issue, inviting people. You know, they didn't just show up in my office by accident. You know, I invited them, and I invited them because I worked for the governor, right? And so I had a certain status that they better show up. You know, again, that was a collaborative process that took 15 minutes. But sometimes they take 15 months or much longer, right, as you know. So you just have to be strategic about it. I'm sorry, but that's like the best answer that I can give you.
Before I give the mic to Rauno, who has the next question, I would like to add the role of the sponsor.
Well, it's tricky because somebody does have to pay. You know, when particularly when there's a long process involving staff work, somebody does have to pay. And the problem that we face at the National Policy Consensus Center is that oftentimes there is an agency, a ministry, that says, yes, we want to be the sponsor for this collaborative process, and they don't say it quite like this, but really what they say between the lines is, and we already have the solution. What we want you to do is get all of these stakeholders on board with what we want to do. And they're very concerned, for good reasons, about not letting the process get out of control and so forth. Because of that, you also have if there is an agency, a single agency sponsoring something, you have everybody else in the room going, now wait a minute. This game is fixed. You know, these people already know what they want. We're just here for political window dressing. And and what we have to say isn't really going to be heard. So, we're very careful about that. Sometimes, if we pick up before the process starts that could be a problem, we won't let a single entity pay for the process. We will look to a shared sponsorship. So that people get a sense of, okay, this is not a fixed game. But we usually have to have the talk with the sponsoring entity that our allegiance is not to them, it's to the group. If they want a collaborative process, we will be working on behalf of the group and helping the group. And we also try to make it clear that's in your interest, yes, it's difficult sometimes. Well, where's the money going to come from in order to pay for this process? But you have to be careful about that, and you have to be attentive to what other people think about what's going on. Go ahead. We were to be done at 5 o'clock. Is it okay if we go a little longer?
Go a little longer, but Rauno has first and then
Yeah.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm Rauno Sairinen. I'm a professor of environmental policy from the University of Eastern Finland, so I'm colleague of Lasse. And my question is a little bit related to what we discussed in concerning Lasse's question, but so perhaps first very much thank you for this presentation, and it's very interesting. And my question or comment is related to the question that, as Henrik Wikström's comment was also, I heard it that way, that really in Finland we don't use these kind of processes or these kind of ideas of this process convener or very much, or perhaps in practical we don't know people, decision makers, politicians, leaders in administration, they don't know about these kind of processes very much, and they can't really, I think, this is my opinion, they can't also develop this kind of, because they don't have an idea what it could be. On the other hand, we have this culture of, a little bit like perhaps Lasse was telling also, this kind of, that how we do and how we think about when different organizations develop these processes, how they think about the leadership of these processes, and so that the ownership of this whole process, who is the one, and then what are these interest groups, how they make the interaction. This Henrik Wikström was also talking about, okay, we need better communication, or we need better interaction, some process, but not this kind of, there was lacking this kind of idea that okay, what is this kind of a really common process of negotiating further issues, and how to develop them. My question, I'm thinking that how we can, in this kind of culture, in this kind of decision-making culture, how we can develop and start developing this kind of new ideas. Because I think there are these kind of big issues, like in this municipality level, this kind of, there are this, okay, if municipality should be a little bit neutral in the processes, but then on the other hand, as in this Inco case, they are making the land use decisions concerning this big industry, and they are political decision-making processes, and they are not neutral. They are making the final process, and they can't say it just. I understand that perhaps the organization can be more neutral, but then also the question of representatives. Representative democracy, that very often, however, we in Finland, I think it's very valued issue. And then if we talk about some kind of other processes, then there are many questions and okay, how, but we have this representative democracy, how we can have this kind of selected people making this process. Then suddenly, if we start something, that kind of process, then suddenly some people come and some decision makers decide, hey, we do it this way because we have the majority. Yeah. But so the whole, I think there's a question of how to, because I think this kind of process could be very good in Finland to develop, and it would help making these solutions also for green development. But how to develop this culture of decision making possible? Thanks.
Well, there are about 5 questions there that I counted in your comments. I think the first thing I would say in response, you were saying you don't have a lot of history with the use of these kinds of processes or the use of that official convening role. You may recall that one of my first slides talked about this as an underutilized role for elected leaders or leaders of any kind. And I wasn't referring to Finland. I was referring to the United States, and other countries. So my point being that don't assume because we are using this model that it is used all the time in the US either, or even in Oregon, because I think too often the potential for leaders to play that role to their benefit is underutilized. The other thing that I want to come back to in terms of what you said, I think that the question you raised is really in a lot of ways about the legitimacy of these processes when you have other people who are, quote, the decision makers. And the point I want to make about that is that these collaborative processes don't take the place of the sort of legal responsibility of certain elected officials to make a decision. It's actually a way of empowering them to make a better decision. It is a way of helping inform them so they know if I choose this road, what I know is that all of these people over here representing these different stakeholder groups, these different interests, have all agreed that this is okay. So what I know as a decision maker is that if I make that decision, these people are not going to be mad at me, right? And that it has a better chance of being implemented more smoothly because you have the support of all these different other groups and organizations. So I think it is important to pay attention to that question of legitimacy, of, again, I go back to my old American phrase of who died and made you God, and you have to think about that. You have to make sure that what you're doing is that there's some legitimacy to it. But these collaborative groups, I mean, as Lasse said, there are all kinds of task forces, cross-organizational task forces going on all the time in Finland and the US and almost every other country I can think of, including some authoritarian countries that I've been spending some time in. So, but the question is really, how do you make them more effective? How do you make them more successful? I happen to believe that when people work together in the right way, they can come up with results that are better than if they were not working together. And the only caveat, the only condition is that those processes are thoughtful and done well. And my belief is that one of the ways of doing them well is to think about who is the right person or persons to bring people together in the first place, to play that convening role. So I'm not sure I answered all 5 of your questions, but there you go.
And this is now the last comment.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Thank you very much, and thank you. It's been very, very interesting to listen to you. I'm Heidi Kruger. I work at the Nature and Game Management Trust in Finland, and I used to work for the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry in Finland at the Department of Game and Fisheries, and not for the Saimaa ring seal, but I followed that one, and we had there a lot of different other different problematic species, and actually I must say that what I remember from those things and what you are also that we had a lot of science and knowledge about the species, and that but we were forced to take Accordi and other these facilitators with in the discussions because we lacked all science about people. And I would say that's even also in my current job, and I think that's I'm a biologist and an agronomist. I have no idea of people and psychology, and I sort of lack that information, and I'm very happy because I have had the chance to go to these schoolings by Accordi, and I have had the chance to listen to you also earlier, and I'm very eager to learn about this. But I think in Finland, like you, Rauno, said, that we lack completely these processes where like Henrik here was telling that there's this now when these UVA processes are starting, now people are very worried and they don't know what is happening. And actually, what we are missing that it's about the people there, not so much about the environmental effects. It's about addressing those people and hearing them. And I think we often go against the wall, and first then we start to ask, okay, should we perhaps take the people's and listen to them also? So I think that's something that should be. I don't know. We need a lot more sort of cooperation between these social sciences and then these sort of exact sciences. Like, yeah, I must say that. And I would like to know about you also already answered that this is not happening everywhere in the US, but your group, what is your background? How have you come to this, and what is?
Boy, how long do you have? First of all, I would say that I spent 15 years in my career being a regional administrator for a state agency. I've worked at the state government level in the U.S., at the local government level in the U.S., and at the federal government level in the U.S. So I've seen all those, and I've also worked in the private sector. That has helped to give me a perspective. I also have had the benefit, in my education for public administration. I spent a fair amount of that looking at collaborative processes and negotiation theory. So that's where I come from. That's what I bring to this field. But I also say I'm learning every week. Every week I'm learning, more things. The point that I would like to make, though, in response to what you're saying is that the things that I have talked about today, and which I teach at the university in Oregon, are based upon real research. It is not just kind of like, well, I had this idea, that wouldn't it be nice if people worked together? That what I think a lot of people do not understand is that there is very hard research about, and actually mathematical research about how people work together and what kinds of processes, what kinds of things help people work together better. And so it's not just some loose idea, that I got from reading a comic book, that there is actual hard research and data that shows, what works and what does not. And you're right. Good for you for recognizing maybe you should take advantage of other people's expertise to help you in your own efforts. So yeah, thank you. I just want to say before your final comments, thank you for your attention, and I do want to say I appreciate the fact that this presentation has been in what is for almost all of you a second language. And I will tell you that if this had to have been in Finnish, it would have been a very short presentation indeed. So thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. Yeah.
Tilaisuus on nyt päättynyt ja tosiaan huomenna osa teistä osallistuukin Steven ja Kristenin koulutukseen. Edelleen on mahdollista ehkä tulla paikalle, jos sattumalta pääsee koko huomiseksi päiväksi, mutta tämä ei ole sinne enää lähetykseen. Niin Steve siellä huomenna kertoo semmoisen tavallaan sen origin storyn, että miten Oregonissa tämä homma